Welcome to this fourth and I believe final session where we will explore resilience, active citizenship, higher ambitions in the EU and a structure for national work ? And of course this is trying to tie together a very charged conference with many different perspectives, but I wanted to bring us back to the core a little bit just to start this panel. We're in an era where we're all fed emotionally charged narratives. It's a malicious mixture of fake and truth designed to exploit our cognitive weaknesses or, if you want, our innate biases. The causality between online discourse and offline events needs more research, but there is a tie between hate speech on platforms and racist and misogynist violence. It's true and it exists. We can see it evolve. Even failing trust in democratic institutions, electoral results, and traditional media could be linked to successfully disseminated disinformation and propaganda. No one is totally protected, even though many of us think we are. We think we are smarter than that, but we're not. Against this alarming backdrop, the European Union has identified the importance of strengthening citizens' resilience through media and information literacy efforts and is following up on the member states' efforts through the reporting exercise foreseen in the revised Audiovisual Media Services Directory. In this panel, we will explore ongoing initiatives in the member states from practitioners' cases, from government, industry, academia, and civil society, and, of course, the opportunities involved in this cross-sectoral approach. Just to finalize this opening, I think that not only democracy itself depend on this, but I think actually democracy in the entire world, because I think Europe at the moment has a choice of where we're going, and so how well we navigate from here, it's truly a question of the evolution of where we're going from here. With this said, we have an amazing panel for you to dig into this very serious but also very exciting topic. Kicking this off is Emma Goodman, who has a tie, of course, for those who have seen the program, to the London School of Economics, but she's today representing the European Digital Media Observatory, the EDMO, and she is there. She's the Media Literacy Research Lead. Let's give her a warm welcome.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. I'm delighted to be here and have very much enjoyed the presentations and discussions so far. So what I would like to do in these 10 minutes is to briefly introduce EDMO, then move on to a bit about media literacy's role in fighting disinformation, and give an overview of the work we are doing at EDMO. So many of you, I imagine, might be familiar with EDMO and its origins, but for anyone who is not, the idea to create an independent, multi-stakeholder European digital media observatory to tackle disinformation across Europe emerged out of the discussions of the high-level expert group on fake news and online disinformation, which reported in 2018. And EDMO is funded by the European Commission, and the consortium, which is led by the European University Institute, started work in 2020. Following a second tender process last year, EDMO's mandate was renewed at the end of 2022 for a further 30 months, with additional partners in place from across the EU. And crucial to EDMO's mission are the national and multinational hubs. So 6 new hubs were announced at the end of 2022, and along with the 8 that were already operating, these now cover all EU member states. And each hub consists of a multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary alliance, and carries out research and activities in its local market or markets. And EDMO's activities include setting up a secure collaborative platform for fact-checkers, researchers, and other experts, doing a lot of mapping work, building collections of resources, working with and behalf of researchers for increased access to platform data, bringing stakeholders together for conferences and events, and much more. And so just to give a couple of examples, EDMO set up a fact-checking network across Europe to foster collaboration in tackling disinformation. And based on this network's experience, it publishes monthly fact-checking briefs which outline the current trends in disinformation across Europe. In the area of research, EDMO is part of the task force that is ensuring that the strengthened Code of Practice on Disinformation is future-proof and fit for purpose. And EDMO is also putting together another task force which is dedicated to developing the methodology for coming up with the structural indicators that will be used to assess the impact of the code. And on training, EDMO offers an array of free training opportunities, and I'm actually going to listen in on one tomorrow on historical approaches to disinformation and conspiracy theories. And now I'd like to talk about why we believe that digital media literacy is essential for fighting online mis and disinformation. As I'm sure everyone here knows, disinformation is a highly complex problem, and to tackle it requires a multifaceted effort. And it's only by bringing together a combination of approaches at each point in the process of information creation, distribution, and consumption do we have any hope of really addressing it. So media literacy plays a vital role at the point of information consumption. And of course, we do need action as well taken at other points in this sort of chain of production. We need legislators and tech companies to reduce the ease of spreading disinformation and the incentives to do so. Of course, we need fact-checking, and we need debunking, and we need sustainable quality journalism. But media literacy is undoubtedly a crucial tool in the fight against disinformation. It would be impossible and undesirable to tightly control the spread of information, and so a public that is both critically and digitally literate will be empowered to access the information that they encounter online, understand the motivations behind it, identify which sources they can trust, and make well-informed decisions as citizens and consumers, and more. Being media literate opens up opportunities to engage more fully, more creatively with the online and offline media world, and any regulation or other initiatives will be less effective without an accompanying level of education and awareness. However, building levels of media literacy isn't an easy solution, and to do it well requires a significant amount of time and money. And as one of my LSE colleagues, Professor Sonia Livingston, frequently argues, media literacy has tended to be seen by policymakers as sort of an easy win, but in fact it is incredibly complicated. Media literacy education is something that's essential for adults as well as children. It's not something that you learn once and then you're done. It's a complex, intertwined set of skills and competencies. According to the European Commission's Media Literacy Expert Group, media literacy includes all the technical, cognitive, social, civic, and creative capacities that allow citizens to access the media, to have a critical understanding of it, and to interact with it. So it involves both practical skills and, just as importantly, knowledge and awareness of the digital environment, how it operates, and the role it plays in society. In this sense, it is a lifelong process, as digital and media environments are constantly evolving. And because there is so much about the online world that is constantly changing and also illegible, it's crucial to avoid burdening the citizen with the responsibility of trying to understand the incomprehensible. So now I'd like to move on to what media literacy looks like within EDMO. So when the second mandate for the EU-led EDMO consortium was confirmed at the end of last year, it came with a strengthened focus on media literacy as one of the core pillars. We have a new media literacy-focused partner organization, the Media and Learning Association, which is very exciting because it means we'll be able to accomplish much more over the next 2.5 years. There is also media literacy expertise in each of the 14 EDMO hubs, and each of the hubs is developing its own media literacy resources and projects which are aimed at its local market or markets. And we have thought very hard about how EDMO can make a positive contribution to the media literacy sector. So one of the main challenges within the media literacy world is that it's a sort of a fragmented field, both at a European level and at a national level, with a different setup in each country in terms of institutions, national curricula. It involves a wide array of stakeholders, including policymakers, educational bodies, regulators, researchers, schools, librarians, campaigners, NGOs, news organizations, tech companies, and more. And media literacy projects range from mass public awareness campaigns to highly targeted in-person training for individuals. A project might produce games or YouTube videos or library resources. They might generate online nudges, or they could engage school children in conversations about media and democracy. So one of the key areas we believe EDMO contribute to is mapping the landscape. We've published an overview report of media literacy at a European level, and we are now, in conjunction with experts at the EDMO national hubs, producing country profiles for each EU member state, which outline national policies and frameworks, the status of digital media literacy, both within and outside of formal education, the activities of the relevant EDMO hub, and they also provide links to a selection of key stakeholders. And related to the same issue of fragmentation, we are also working to promote knowledge exchange across sectors and across borders. We've already started this with the EDMO hubs, and we are in the process of building a trusted forum for all the media literacy experts and practitioners within the hubs to participate in. We're encouraging and facilitating the development of joint initiatives as well as mentoring between the hubs. And looking to the wider media literacy community, EDMO provides free training sessions, as I already mentioned. We ran some very popular sessions on the evaluation of media literacy initiatives last year. And we've also run webinars to share the hub's activities and research findings, and we'll have more coming up. And another area which we believe EDMO has the potential for significant impact is in raising standards throughout the sector. So based on our research and discussions, we've identified a need for more attention on standards and best practices for media literacy initiatives. And we're planning to start work on developing these over the coming months. We plan to consult widely on this, seeking as many viewpoints as possible. Of course, we realize that consensus on every aspect won't be easy, and we wouldn't want to propose a sort of one-size-fits-all approach, but we think there is scope for progress here. So based on these standards, we would produce guidelines for different stakeholders and case studies of projects that met the various standards as a source for inspiration to other practitioners. And we will also use these in combination with the country profiles to gather evidence of effective strategies that can inform the policy debate about raising media literacy levels across society. And I think I might be out of time, so I'm going to finish there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emma. Very impressive work. We will go back to whatever you didn't have the time to say now in the panel. So next keynote is from the Google subsidiary Jigsaw, bringing us insights from their perspective and a case study on media literacy in practice at large scale, maybe one can say. The floor is yours, Beth Goldberg, please.
Thank you so much, Annette, and thank you to all of you for having me here today. I'm going to be sharing something a little bit different than what we've had thus far today. I'm going to show you a very concrete example of a case study we've just wrapped up in Central Europe. And I'm also going to introduce you to an argument that we've perhaps been focusing on only half of the equation for tackling misinformation. So much of our conversations, both in the regulatory regime and in political discourse, are about the supply of misinformation. Think about it as like the supply of weapons. We're regulating the supply. But we're not thinking about the demand and the way that users are consuming, people, our citizens are consuming this misinformation. So I'm going to make a case that we focus on that other half, the users and their consumption patterns, which actually Emma just teed up really beautifully for me. So thank you. Okay, so I'm going to frame the goal here as getting ahead of misinformation and helping our citizens anticipate misinformation. I'll start with an example. This is a video from earlier last year when the Ukrainian migrants were fleeing Ukraine and appearing in places like Germany and elsewhere to settle. And there were a number of misinformation claims, and this one in particular is a video from southern Germany where Ukrainian refugees, ukrainische Flüchtlinge, were accused of burning down a house. Now, this video is clearly fabricated. That chyron of text at the bottom was just pasted on. They even went so far as to paste a graphic of the magazine Das Bild. But this was quickly debunked within a few days. Stop Fake in Ukraine, Vox News, and others identified through Google reverse image search that this video is actually from 2013. But it was too late. This video had already gone viral on a number of social media platforms, and there had already been retributive attacks against refugees in this part of Germany. So I want to make the argument that debunking or post hoc corrections, like fact checks, are important but insufficient. The scale and the speed of misinformation is simply too much for us to keep investing just in post hoc interventions. So my question for us is, can we preempt misinformation? Can we invest in getting out ahead of it? If you will, if coming after is called debunking, then coming before the misinformation, we can call it prebunking. I know it was mentioned yesterday. So I'm making the case that yes, we can preempt misinformation. In fact, there's quite a bit of research in this field. And that the reason is, the Achilles heel of misinformation, if you will, is that it reuses the same tropes and narratives, such that we can look at historical patterns and anticipate what we might see in the future. So to go back to our example from Germany, we could look historically and see in the 2015-16 EU migrant crisis that there were a number of misinformation claims demonizing refugees as criminals. Particularly provocative picture here from a Polish magazine in 2016 that I think shows that very viscerally. And we saw those same misleading narratives about refugees in 2022. So I think that tees us up well to make the case for getting out ahead of this misinformation, for saying we can anticipate it and we can teach the citizens in our communities how to be better defended against it, how to defend themselves against it. But I should pause because I haven't properly introduced who I am or why we're doing this. The organization I work for is called Jigsaw. We're a think and do tank inside of Google. We are an interdisciplinary team of researchers and engineers and product managers who focus on proactive tools to address threats to open society. Everything we do is free and open sourced and for the better of the internet. We've recently published in Brussels in November a set of different tools to proactively address threats like misinformation. So there are things like nudges that Emma mentioned, but there are also things like prebunking, which is where I'm going to focus for the next few minutes with you all. But you can see the full list of these at interventionswithgoogle.com. Prebunking is actually a communication technique that takes this medical metaphor of antibodies, and the concept here is about building mental antibodies, much the same way that your body would build physical antibodies when you get vaccinated against a virus. This time, you're getting mentally inoculated against an unwanted persuasion attempt. So think propaganda. Can you build resilience to that propaganda before you see it? Now, this is actually something that was developed in the 1960s, and there's been extensive testing across the academic field. I just want to call this out. This is not an academic conference, but I wanted to note that the application of this approach to mis and disinformation has only been in the last 4 or 5 years. This is an incredibly nascent field of work. We have a lot to learn, but we've been working with some of the top academics in the field to really figure out how can we apply this tool to mis and disinformation and the other harms on the internet we're so interested in tackling. My team at Jigsaw has teamed up with a number of the top scholars in the world, psychologists, sociologists, political scientists, to test this approach, first in short videos in a lab setting, right? We don't want to just experiment on populations on social media before we're really confident in the science. And we've tested first misinformation techniques. So over on the left side, there are a series of short videos that we produced with universities of Cambridge and Bristol. And we looked at things that you might learn in a Logic 101 class, things like a false dichotomy or fear-mongering. And those were incredibly effective because they're very apolitical. Then we went on and looked at more specific misinformation narratives, anti-vaccine narratives, white and male supremacist narratives, and we similarly saw that this approach was effective. We've got links here to the publications, but please find me afterwards if you'd like to learn more about these. But But at a high level, why is this approach relevant to your work? Not only do we know scientifically that this builds cognitive resilience to mis and disinformation or other hateful narratives, but it can be extremely apolitical in approach. This is one of the only approaches to tackling misinformation that I've seen in my research that is effective across the political spectrum. It takes the framing of self-defense rather than focusing on contentious specific claims. It's above the political fray. And lastly, it's accessible and non-judgmental. This is an educational tool. It's basically a subset of media literacy. So you're not assuming your audience has any pre-existing knowledge on the topic. I'm quickly going to walk you through a case study, like I mentioned, of work that we've just wrapped up in Central Europe, and I think that will help illuminate what this is and why it's so promising. So we wanted to focus on anti-Ukrainian migrant sentiment because we could anticipate, like I mentioned at the top of this presentation, that there would be strong misinformation claims about refugees. So my team and I spent over a month on the ground in Poland, Slovakia, and Czechia talking to experts, and we really wanted them to tell us what were the misinformation narratives likely to be 3 months from now. Can you look at historical patterns of fact checks, of misinformation trends in your region, and tell us where you think the conversation might go in 3 months? And they identified 2 primary narratives. One was economic, and one was security. The economic narrative was a trope that you all are familiar with. The refugees are going to take our jobs. But this one was actually focused on housing, and it really used this rhetorical technique of scapegoating. The second was a security narrative that you've also heard. Refugees are dangerous and they're criminals. But this one was specifically focused on rising crime in the evenings. Don't go out in the evenings. And that uses fear-mongering. It elicits the emotion of fear in the viewer. So we worked with a number of collaborators from government, civil society, fact-checking, and academia to put together video scripts and produce videos in each country. And I'm actually going to show you one now.
Válka neprobíhá pouze na Ukrajině. Ovlivňuje nás všechny i skrze naše mobilní telefony. Pro výhru jsou totiž někteří ochotní udělat cokoliv. Například v nás vyvolávat strach tím, že všechny ukrajinské uprchlíky označí za nebezpečné.
Haló, jsi tady?
Jsem, ale asi půjdu. Už bude tma a já si teď večer sama venku nepřipadám úplně bezpečně, co jsou tu ty uprchlíci.
Počkej, to myslíš vážně?
Teď čtu na internetu, že přepadávají lidi přímo na ulici. Teď jsou nebezpeční.
Většina uprchlíků jsou jenom ženy a malí děti. Jde jenom o snahu vyvolat v nás strach.
Proč by lhali?
Některý lidi nás chtějí proti Ukrajincům poštvat. Je jednodušší ovlivnit lidi, kteří se něčeho bojí a odvést pozornost od skutečného důvodu, proč tady uprchlíci jsou. A to je válka.
Pokud v nás někdo vyvolává strach, může se pokoušet ovlivnit naše emoce a zmanipulovat nás. Metoda vyvolávání strachu je jednou z nejběžnějších taktik pro šíření dezinformací. Nenechte se sebou manipulovat.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed that. That's one of the 6 videos we produced. You can find them on YouTube. This one was for the Czech Republic. And what we did was we used a tool that Google knows well, ads, to reach people with these videos. We actually used ads on YouTube as well as Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok. And we ran them just like any other third-party advertiser would run an ad campaign. So you all could replicate what we did here if you wanted to go out and purchase ads and show these videos. I won't go into the success measures, but essentially we followed up one day later with folks with one of these one-question surveys you may have seen on YouTube, and we gave them a pop quiz. And we said, did you learn what fear-mongering is from that video? So here's what we found. We were able to reach over 15 million Europeans in just a 2-month campaign. And this is an enormous percentage of these populations in these 3 countries. Did it work? Yes. The good news is we had 2 to 3% difference between a treatment and a control group, which means that over 300,000 people gained resilience to these misinformation techniques. I want to end with encouragement for all of you to think about how you might use this approach to empower others to pre-bunk misinformation in your own communities. So we are interested in scaling this approach to more audiences and more geographies, but we can't do that with my small team sitting in New York. So we're open sourcing our approach. We're looking broadly to partner with others. We'll be working in India and Indonesia this year, among other places. And we're looking for other measures of success. To start with that, we released this practical guide to pre-bunking misinformation that you all are welcome to download. And with that, I will say thank you so much for your time and look forward to the panel.
Thank you, Beth. Very promising and interesting example. The third and the final speech will actually tie into what's already been said on indicators and measurements, because it will be delivered by the Director General of the Norwegian Regulatory Media Authority, Medietillsynet, Mari Welsand. Welcome up. Mari will talk about population MIL and the Nordic example. The floor is yours.
Thank you. As we all know, and we have already talked a lot about today, having good media literacy skills is becoming more and more important as we as citizens are facing challenges in the digital media environment. And contributing to media literacy is also becoming a very important task for many of the media authorities. Since 2019, we in the Norwegian Media Authority have conducted a study in the Norwegian population every other year, asking questions and giving the respondents tasks to try to find out more about the media literacy skills in different groups. We have been covering issues as source criticism, the difference between commercial and editorial content, the difference between different kinds of media, and trust in media, to give some examples. And as we heard from several speakers already at this conference, there are quite a few similarities between the Nordic countries. And we have for many years also had a good cooperation between the media authorities in the Nordic countries. So we then started to talk about maybe we can do something together here. And we already had a cooperation with our colleagues in Iceland. So they conducted a survey based on the ones we have been done in Norway. And then some time ago, we decided to start to work together on a joint Nordic project to develop a study that can be run in all the Nordic countries. All media authorities in the Nordic countries take part in this project, which is led by the Swedish Media Council. We had a pre-study done in December 2020 that was done by NTNU in Norway. And we so far have a draft budget of 3 million Danish kroner for this project, and we have gotten financial support from the Nordic Council of Ministers, and we are very happy and satisfied for that. We believe that measuring different aspects of media literacy on a regular basis is important to be able to follow the development over time. This kind of knowledge is important to provide a basis for future efforts within the field, helping us also to prioritize right. For example, we have from the Norwegian studies found that not only the youngest group that we kind of knew, but also the oldest age group is vulnerable when it comes to media literacy skills. As there are many similarities between the Nordic countries, we also think that it's interesting to be able to measure and to see similarities and differences between the Nordic countries, and that also can give us some interesting information. And finally, we believe that studies like this will make it easier for us to report on media literacy, not only on activities, but also the skills. And that will also help us, for example, when reporting what is being required from the revised AMSD directive. a bit about the plan on how to move forward. We hope to have developed a questionnaire to use in this new joint Nordic study by the time of Q3 this year, and to be able to run a pilot study and test analysis methods. And then do the baseline data collection late this year in order to have the first results early next year. And as I said already, our Swedish colleagues, it's then the Swedish Media Council that will lead this project with the colleagues from the other Nordic media authorities as a reference group. And we're now working to find Nordic scientific experts to use as consultants in the project, and of course a company to carry out the data collection for us. And as you can imagine, this is quite a complex task, but also a very exciting one. And we are very much looking forward to getting it all started. And we think it's also very exciting to be able to have this as a joint Nordic project. And hopefully we can get back to you with some more information at a later stage. So thank you so far.
Mari, please stay, because we're going to invite all the panel up now, and specifically we will also invite, because media literacy is not only a story for women, of course, we will invite Niklas Ceralmi, who's the director of the Swedish Museum of Work, who has been exploring cutting-edge pedagogical practices in this field, and also Sofia Kartunen, who is legal officer at the European Commission, since very recently in charge of the MIL reporting foreseen in the AVMSD. So please, and Emma coming back, and Beth coming back. Welcome up. Let's give the panel an applaud now. They're all gathered. So you've seen, and we all know, of course, that media literacy is considered an important means to stimulate critical thinking. We've even seen academic results pointing us that way. Some worry that critical thinking is already there, but too protruding, that we're, how can I say, we're creating a generation where you're critical against everything, making it actually difficult to believe anything or anybody. I can just go myself. As soon as you see information today, you get that, wow, can I really trust this? Especially when it's really exceptional information. MIL, the part of MIL meaning also that through complexity we need to be able to find something we can rely on, somebody we can trust. And we of course believe legacy media, traditional responsible media, is part of that trust pillar, so to speak. So I would just like to open this panel with a question talking about this MIL's role in trust in the society of today. Perhaps I could maybe rephrase it a little bit and say, what differences can actually MIL do? Because also sometimes we feel that MIL becomes this remedy to everything. We have so many problems now, and it's like, yes, but MIL will solve it. Can MIL really be, can media and information literacy be a remedy to everything? And what do you say, Niklas? What is your experience?
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm quite honored to be part of this conference. I would say that MIL, media information literacy, is a kind of balance between source criticism on one hand, where you have a sound criticism to the sender, and source trust on the other hand, where you have a sound trust to the sender. And as the English saying goes, too much of anything is good for nothing. So if you emphasize MIL or MIL completely, then you eventually will become a conspiracy theorist. And that does not foster trust, I would say. And this has always been the case, but now we are challenging, like, for example, deepfake artificial intelligence, which can, in a live feed, totally alter the message that we receive, which leads to me understanding that I cannot any longer trust my experiencing senses when watching a live feed.
Yes.
What I see and what I hear is totally disconnected from what is true. which is a huge problem. And I would say that you can, as a citizen or as a media consumer, you can react in two ways. You can try to become an expert in mill, but as you said earlier, Annette, and as we have seen, it's almost impossible to be bulletproof to mis and disinformation. So I think we are developing some kind of general source trust to a limited amount of senders. And unfortunately, we end up in pools where we have general trust to different senders, and that is a huge problem.
And before letting you go to the wider panel, what you have created a very interesting project that I would like you to mention briefly, dealing with exactly what you're talking about now. This how do you work with something more neutral approach, feeding into different target audiences?
Yeah.
Democracy Lab?
Exactly. How much time do I have?
Very little, but
very little.
Explain it to us.
Yeah.
Please.
Okay. So we are trying to make a tool for media information literacy. We call it Democracy Lab. We're sending it to places where people are and where people meet, workplaces, malls, hospital foyers, and so on. And there we try to give people who rarely visit museums, so we search them up instead, tools to understand what is true and what is not true. I talked to a right politician about this the other week, and she said, okay, so you're building an exhibition which tells people not to vote for populistic parties. And I said, if our project is received as such, all the money is in vain and all the money is wasted. So we are trying to find a common ground, a starting point, where we have a we with the audience. And it's focusing on a very common ground, saying something like at least we should try to find a point where you as a citizen can try in your own best way to build our worldview on things that are, as far as we can see, true. So build our worldview on things that are true. And it's quite important that we don't mess with how this conversations that people have in our exhibitions, how it ends politically. It's not of our business. We have to stay away from that completely. So just this very simple thing: build your worldview on things that are true. No one can actually oppose that.
No, this is it, and this is so interesting. And Beth, maybe you will like to comment. I'm sure you recognize some of the aspects of what Nicholas just told us.
Absolutely. One of the things I loved that Nicholas just said is the framing of media and information literacy as preventive medicine, as something that you might do before you fall down the rabbit hole, to prevent yourself from falling down the rabbit hole. And so I think, it's certainly not a silver bullet, it's certainly not going to stop misinformation, but I think it could prevent the amplification of it, it could prevent more people from becoming believers of misinformation.
Can I just add to that? Because, so we're talking about granularity in target groups, actually, because and I know that you have some specific data also from your big scale data collection on Gen Z.
I do. So
are they different from the rest of us, or what can you see there?
I'm going to share some hot off the press research with all of you. My team and a group of anthropologists just finished an ethnographic study with Gen Zers in the US and India, and we wanted to understand how are they forming these media literacy and information literacy concepts? How are they learning this? How are they applying it when they're scrolling through TikTok? The answer is they're not. They're actually not even approaching information from the same literacy mindset that all of us learned. We think about what is the source credibility, what is the veracity of this, and to discern that, we go and we maybe go Google search it, or we go to Wikipedia, or we go sort of try to fact check ourselves. Gen Z has a fundamentally different approach, and I'll cut right to the punchline, which is they rely on their peers. They rely on something we're calling distributed trust, which is an entirely new paradigm that gets away from media and information literacy. And it says, what can I glean from the comment section? What can I glean from how many people liked this post versus that post?
This is exactly what's also weaponized, because herd behavior is very easily manipulated, because we know even from the 60s research of Kahneman and others that if we think the group, even though they're all lying, we want to be part of the group. So that's really. I would like to let Sofia in also on this. We've been talking about, so from of course the policy perspective and from the structuring all this. If we're going towards very distinguished and many new target groups and target audiences, is that a challenge from your perspective? Would you like to say something about just come into the discussion through your perspective?
Yes, sure. Maybe to start with the regulatory framework. Now, for the first time, the revised Audiovisual Media Services Directive imposes some legal obligations concerning media literacy. Firstly, for member states to promote and take measures to develop media literacy, and also for member states to make sure that video sharing platforms under their jurisdiction take effective measures and they have effective tools and they raise users' awareness of such tools. So we have this two-tier approach involving different players. But the directive itself, it does not prescribe what actions exactly these players have to take to promote and develop media literacy. So it encapsulates quite a holistic approach, but we have some steering, namely coming from the Commission and ERGA, in the framework of the Media Literacy Toolbox, which gives a list of certain actions that can be taken by video sharing platforms to fulfill their obligation under the directive. And then we also have the Commission guidelines giving a bit of guidance regarding a member state's obligation to report on which actions they are taking. And we hope that with these tools, different stakeholders can seek a bit of inspiration what they can do. And namely in the guidelines, which the Commission will publish next month, unfortunately a bit late, we will give 5 different categories, different sections under which member states can report on their measures that they have taken, namely legal and policy measures, organizational measures, public funding and other financing arrangements for media literacy, and engagement and awareness-raising activities, media literacy curricula, and different evaluation measures and methods. We hope this will be useful.
It's a first step. It's very interesting, and we're all following it keenly, of course. I guess that what we're talking about here is maybe for the next iteration, because I believe that maybe what we're saying, if it's not one size fit all, we will need also the member states to work more granular and more, and also, of course, the reporting need to be in that direction. What Beth was saying on differences in the population. I know you have interesting data also from the Norwegian study, Mari. Would you like to share? You had the differences in age that you saw very clearly.
Yes, and I mentioned it a little bit already, and you were talking about the young age groups. But what we experienced was that we also have a challenge with the oldest group, and we tend to focus on the young groups, and that's good, and we have to continue with that. But at the same time, we really also have to be aware of the oldest groups, and what some of them told us was that they were used to that what they read in the newspaper was true, and then they took that view with them into the digital area, and then it's not the same way. So maybe it's harder also to change because they have been there for such a long time, but still it's a big group. So after finding this out, within our authority, we have developed some toolboxes that's made for the older group that we made together with some organizations that organize seniors, because you also have to communicate to different groups in different ways. So I think, as you said, Annette, it's not like one size fits all. You really need to adjust it according to which group you talk to, and not only from age, but that's one thing you need to keep in mind. Does your results, do they exist in English? I think we have a summary in
Okay,
English.
so that's excellent, because I really advise you to look into it, because you can see how literacy is, how the young are literate in their media circuit and how the elder age group are literate in theirs, meaning a young person having to decode a paper will not be good at it, etc. So it's working in both ways. I think it's very promising to hear things are moving. Promoting media information literacy, we who have been part of that work for some time, we have seen it, I think, move from a time of largely a time where we had a lot of enthusiasts really passionate about democracy and wishing to make a difference, but possibly not being so structured or even measure what we do. A lot of people just carried out a lot of activities, actually. And lately we can see, and you can hear it here in the panel, that it's maturing. It's becoming a more professional environment, more solid approaches, building sustainable infrastructure, long-term capacity building, and multi-stakeholder networks that, for instance, Emma was showing us an example of. Knowledge sharing, coordination, all those things. In your and in the EDMO's experience, Emma, what do you see as opportunities and challenges with that?
Yeah, no, I agree that, and I just wanted to say that I think it's fantastic, Mari, that you're doing work with older people as well, because I think one of the big challenges generally for media literacy is that obviously young people who are still in schools are sort of easier to reach, but adults aren't. So if there are ways to reach them, that's the kind of thing that I think it would be great, and something we can help do is try to kind of sort of share these ways that these things are happening. Because I know that a lot of people are struggling with that. And something we've had a lot of feedback at EDMO as well is that, yes, so the sort of evaluation of initiatives and policies is a big challenge. And there are which is actually a reason why your work is also fantastic on assessing media literacy levels in society, because that's something that is really hard to do. And so, I mean, I think it's, so it's great that there is more attention to that. As you say, it's becoming a more sort of professional thing, and there is a sort of need. People feel the need to try and evaluate what's going on, and hopefully be able to share sort of successes, because it's a really hard thing, to measure. Media literacy levels are very, very hard to measure. It's very hard to measure the sort of success of a project or the true impact. But obviously, if we don't do that, and then we don't know what works, then we can't really improve on things. So I think that given the amount of attention there is to that now, that is a real opportunity.
Thank you.
I just wanted to comment on what you said about measuring, because you are so right, that's really hard. So, and we all know that when we're asked something about our own capacity, it's easy to say that, yes, I'm aware of this, or yes, I know how to do this. So what we do to kind of prevent some of that was that we also gave the respondents some tasks. For example, they got to see some articles, and some were true and some were false, and they were asked to identify which were true news stories and not. And also we gave them, for example, some commercial stories that were paid for and some news stories, and it's not always easy to see the difference, even though they should be marked. So that also gave us better information to be able to say something about the skills.
Anybody else would like to comment on indicators and the difficulty of measuring? No. Okay. We were talking about structuring infrastructure. Of course, we have the European Commission's initiative now. We will soon see it rolling. We don't know yet how that will. What overview will we get? But I guess we will get some overview, and of course, some knowledge. Best cases, maybe even, will be able to be extracted from that exercise. But it's as I understand it, it's rather vague. It's not a standard that this is what we all need to do. The member states can report a little bit in their own way, and I'm just wanted to balance that with a Nordic initiative here, where I understand that you're trying to, and now a little bit of transparency. I was part of that project. I need to say that because I was the Director General of the Swedish Media Council when this started. But you're trying to actually set a Nordic standard, I think. So pros and cons on keeping it open or actually pinpointing a standard. Would you like to say something? Sofia, would you like to start?
Yes, of course, all the initiatives in this field are more than welcome, because we need holistic approaches and involving as many players in this exercise as possible. Our media literacy reporting by the member states will be just one part of the project, which will hopefully identify indeed some best practices, maybe give credit to good initiatives, and to check that member states are doing something in this field also. And it can also help to identify some shortcomings where maybe more can be done, and then identify the strengths. And I think all these projects put together, they can help to achieve the overall goal, for which you said there's no one-size-fits-all approach, or no any ending date when all the efforts will be finally completed. This is an ongoing project.
And I think at this stage it's hard to say that it should be on this level or that level. So to start with is to define which areas is it important that the citizens have skills or awareness, and then when you kind of measure in the long run, you can see the development, and hopefully efforts in the field will help higher the levels as well.
Yeah, we will all be following that case, I think, closely. That's truly interesting. In your mapping there of all the multi-stakeholders that you're working with and this European network that you're building, Emma, there is something at the moment, I think, with meeting the rising complexity, where we're all trying to build really complex structures to meet this, and parallel similar initiatives maybe. I'm sure there's a lot of people here felt like, but we also do that, that type of network. And how many networks should we have, and how much can we actually, something about the too much complexity in the response, maybe. Could you reflect on that?
Yes, and so as part of EDMO, we do participate in groups and networks like the European Commission's Media Literacy Expert Group, and in EPRA's ML group, which are both really great forums, and we don't want to obviously just reproduce work that's already being done. But what we found was that a lot of the people in the hubs we're working with are practitioners who aren't necessarily involved in these other groups, and a lot of the knowledge that had been shared hadn't filtered all the way down to them. Especially from something like the Commission's expert group, because obviously that's attended by a lot of policymakers, and it's not necessarily the knowledge isn't being shared all the way. So yeah, we're trying to really, I suppose, connect people who are actually doing the work, and make sure that they're seeing seeing examples from other countries, and things that they might be able to learn from. And so and that's really one of the ideas now that we have the EDMO hubs that are covering all of Europe, is we can really try and sort of connect people who really would never have heard of what the other one is doing. So obviously the Nordic countries will probably know each other quite well and know what everyone's doing, but maybe there's a great project going on in a completely different part of Europe that they haven't heard of, and so we're going to try and and introduce people, I suppose, who are at different sort of levels of advancement too. In some countries, it is much more advanced than in others. So we're going to try and improve those connections. But yeah, I agree that we don't want to, and we are trying hard not to duplicate.
Yeah, sure. And still, it's also we need to educate the masses. So many flowers should perhaps bloom. You know, this is my question. Nicholas, you have actually in this project that you mentioned earlier, you have reached out to partners now in this next phase, where with big membership organizations. So you're working a little bit in a structure that you create. Also, could you talk about what you've learned from there?
Yeah, absolutely. I will start with the issue of trust, because I think it will be extremely hard to measure the outcome of MIL. It's always hard to measure what is important, unfortunately, and then what we can measure becomes important instead. It's tragic. But to be able to reach out to a lot of people, we have to have their trust. So credibility and trustworthiness, I would say, is the main currency here. I am the chairman of the Swedish Museum Association, and we asked Gothenburg University to examine. We paid them to be a part of their trust studies that they have been doing for decades. And I have some figures here about of the trust in Swedish society. So, for example, political parties, they have a trust balance of minus 21. I can say that that's not very good. The Swedish Church has +8, trade unions -6, and then public service +46, universities +53, and then museums have this figure,
wow,
+59. So there's a 100 points between the political parties on one hand, which have very large trust issues, and museums that have. We are the second best in Swedish society. Only healthcare is better. But the exam was done during the pandemic, so their figures will probably drop afterwards, and we will be on top. But this is a currency that we have to be extremely careful with how we invest it. And going out to people and telling them that we have some kind of truth, or that we are working with agencies or states and so on, that will probably lower that figure. So finding ways of using someone's trust as a currency, investing it and getting it to grow. I think that is the core problem for us. We are right now financed by the Psychological Defense Agency, but we are very careful to say that we are not loyal to the state or to the European Union or to the agencies, but we are loyal to the visitors and to the citizens. And I think that is extremely crucial. So we are also working with 2 trade unions now, the blue color and the white color trade unions, because they are also focused on their members. It's not a agency that comes out and tells people what is right and what is wrong. And so working with our trust, we have a high value, a high level of trust already. And how can we use that to benefit citizens, not benefit the state or the agency, but the citizens that takes a part of our exhibitions. And then again, finding this common ground where we can say that we have a motto in our project that says that if a right-wing extremist group comes to our exhibition, they will be very satisfied leaving it, because they will have very good ideas of how to reveal left-wing propaganda. So this kind of common ground where we invest our credibility, puts it on stake, but tries in a way to find this common ground where we can move together and not being the politically correct person from Stockholm, which would be totally a waste of money.
Very interesting. Keeping the trust through a neutral approach. This triggers a thought. When I was the Director General of the Swedish Media Council, and I greet my colleagues in the room here, we have built a multi-stakeholder network in Sweden. It was decided very early on that it would be built by invite, to be sure that we would control who would be part of this network, of course, given that it's such a crucial question, who's in the circuit and who's not. And eventually, there was, of course, even within that circuit, there were discussions about where different partners started discussing, what does it mean that this partner is inside, etc., and that these dynamics are interesting, and at the moment, I would say also weaponized. So one has to be really, really sure of the rules in these networks and the expectations on each other, and also maybe some resilience there to what might happen when you have that type of attack, I would say. It's part of the hybrid warfare at the moment. This with trust, and it brings us to, I know, a very difficult question, but I want to say this. Beth here is here for Jigsaw and not a formal representative of Google, but since Google and all the other large platforms all have very, how can I say, invested a lot in MIL initiatives and tries or are successful in many to move into different types of stakeholder networks, working very close, sometimes even with government agencies. And this, of course, we're back to the trust question. And I would say being Google and the other platforms as being both a solution, but also being part of the problem. So could you just, even though you're saying this from Jigsaw's perspective, could you say something about it?
Yes, gladly. Thank you. I think it's very fair to recognize that there is a reason not to always trust tech companies. And in fact, there is a reason that there is decline in trust in institutions across the board. There's also decline in expertise, which I think is particularly difficult for Google to deal with because the way that the ranking algorithms work, especially for queries on important topics like health, is to uprank authoritative sources, meaning institutions like the World Health Organization. And when we're seeing citizens all around the world losing trust in those experts, that's a real difficult quandary for us. So we are absolutely investing in media and information literacy. A lot of what I do as a researcher to build that trust is ensure that everything I do is published and transparent. To do that, we often work through universities and civil society. As you saw in the case study I showed, everything was done with local partners on the ground in Poland and in Czechia and Slovakia. So we try to show our homework. We also try to make sure that the money is well spent, right? I think there are a lot of failed media and information literacy initiatives. I just want to say this is a field replete with toolkits and toolboxes that have never been opened. And so I want to make sure that we can show people, yes, here is a training or here is a video, and we know it works. We can show you evidence that this is something you can trust, this is something that will help you, and it will empower you. So I think that framing of saying media and information literacy can be empowering to you as an individual removes the institution from the equation. And I think that's going to be increasingly important to make both that cross-sector approach to making the MIL intervention and to ensuring that the user feels that they have the ultimate say about what is the truth.
Interesting. And just a follow-up question that I haven't prepared that you can say I can't answer, but in the DSA where we have the provision of data, sharing data with researchers, I know there's been some people worried about that data will be shared only with some major American universities and that we will have a new imbalance coming in there. And I saw your logos are really for your partners, but it's American, many of them are Anglo-Saxon at least. So diversity and I would say also the sharing of this data, which it's data for public good that we're talking about. How can we ensure that as we move forward? Do you have an approach for that in your company?
That sounds like a provocation to everyone in this room who's writing that legislation to make sure that there are incentives in place for the companies to share research very broadly. I know that the companies already are creating APIs or access points for researchers to download data, at least limited data, and I know that those are sort of democratized in terms of being very open access to anyone with a .edu. But I think there is probably room for there to be incentives to ensure that the co-researchers who get access to that really important data do come from diverse backgrounds and aren't all from the top 10 universities.
A broad spectrum.
Yeah.
We haven't touched upon the topic of diversity. If this triggers any thoughts in any of you, just please feel free. I don't know if Emma, do you have any? Have you looked into that from any perspective at the EDMO?
In terms of who's getting access to
the data, or even if in from an MIL perspective, differences maybe in how you work in MIL impact in different target groups.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I've looked at. Just generally my work, media literacy, also with the LSE, is that there is it's really, really important to try and reach what is often called hard to reach groups, but which is a phrase a lot of people don't like, because it sort of puts the sort of blame on the groups for being hard to reach. It's often the groups maybe that are underrepresented in media or something like that. But there is, as one of my LSE colleagues, Sonia Livingston, often says, it's if you have a general media literacy initiative, it's likely to benefit the people who are already media literate sort of more. Well, as obviously you want to be reaching is the people who really are not. And so you really need to make sure that you find ways to target things and make things really accessible to everybody if you want to actually sort of increase the levels of society, the levels of media literacy in society, as a whole, and bring everyone to more of a sort of an even playing field. And there are lots of small projects across Europe and the UK that are doing that and working with small groups. So it's the sort of thing that is really hard to scale. And that's where it is interesting, obviously, to have work from tech companies which have massive audiences to be. So it's good to have them involved, though. Obviously, as we're saying, there is the problem with. So it's great that tech companies are involved, but obviously the problem is that tech companies often don't want to explain the intricacies of their business models to everybody. So to make sure that they're not sort of in charge.
The secret sauce
of this, yeah.
Do you have any data, Beth, that you would like to share on this topic? I saw that you were a little bit.
Yeah, there's one area of this that we haven't brought up. We spend a lot of time talking about either larger institutions in society or large online platforms, very large online platforms. But I think it's worth mentioning small and medium platforms, because that's where so much of the hate and the extremism and the misinformation online is hiding out and is festering. And I think if we're having a conversation both about how do we help remove that content, but also how do we help people on those platforms be more resilient, we need to make sure that we're investing in solutions for those small and medium platforms who very often have very small staffs. They don't have folks specializing in content moderation, let alone media literacy. And so one of the things that our team is doing is developing free tools for small and medium platforms to both remove this harmful content, so content moderation tools, and to have nudges or other sort of media literacy interventions on their sites. Basically taking what the large platforms are doing and making it accessible. But I think there's a lot more room for us to be thinking about how we help these smaller platforms.
Well, that's interesting. And that brings me to actually something that we wrote when I did a media inquiry some years ago, where we said that this media literacy reform, and also connecting to somebody talking about resources before, that I think it was even Emma you were referring to the need of more resources to this area. That when we created literacy reform in the 19th century, it was a massive reform, building schools all over the country in Sweden. This is similar. It needs a long-term, sustained approach at a very, very high level. And I think there's still room for insights to understand the size of the task and the longevity that we need to give it to be successful. We're moving into the last area where we're going to talk a little bit about cross-sectoral approaches. MIL is very broad. When we talk policy, of course, it stretches from, I think, culture and education on one side all the way to defense maybe on the other. And when we talk about multi-stakeholder networks, different initiatives, civil society, industry doing initiatives, but when you do those, you meet a policy landscape on a national policy level anyway, that is very very many different stakeholders that might not be so synchronized as we wanted them. Could anybody would like to say anything about that? The difficulties, maybe the friction, anything that happens, so we can learn from it here, because I think here you have a lot of people can learn from whatever you have experienced.
I think it's crucial that you understand the driving forces in civil society, like culture, museums, what is our core values and why are we doing this? And understand that we can't be commanded to be a part of a huge state-driven idea, but it has to come from within. We must be interested in doing this ourselves. It's also it's dependent on trust, because if we are conceived by our audience that we are commanded to do this by the culture department or the state and so on, our trustworthiness will go down. So we and also arm's length to politicians. It's extremely tempting, I understand, for someone with a trust balance of -21 to reach out to someone with a trust balance of +59 and try to use that as a tool to reach out to groups that are hard to find and so on, hard target groups. But in the same moment that we are used as a tool, we become blunt, and we are of no use, because then our trust rates go down, and we can't do anything. Then we are a part of the state, of the big state, or the big business, or whoever.
It's the asset that you will really safeguard.
It's a currency that we have to be very careful how we invest. But in letting us do our thing, and if we can show that we are doing this by our own will, and we are loyal, as I said, not to the state but to the citizens and to the visitors, then we can do our job, but not held in a leash.
No leash.
Leash, sorry.
Enough. Mari.
I just wanted to mention the importance of cooperation, because this is a field where you have many actors. You have media authorities, you have researchers, you have different types of organizations, you have the media, and everyone can play a role in this landscape of media literacy. So I know that in some countries, amongst them in Norway, we have created a network for media literacy. We are facilitating it, but we have a lot of different representatives in there, and the aim is just to exchange information and experiences, and if there is projects that we can work together on, we would do that, but just exchanging information about initiatives is good. And within EPRA, which is the European regulator network, we have also made some tips on how to run these networks that can be usable for countries that hasn't started that yet.
Excellent. Another resource, another tip for you to download from their PRI, I guess. I'll give the last minute to Sofia, because now we've heard all these challenges and things going on, and you're going to try and organize this data coming into the Commission. What do you think when we have all that? What does success look like? What will we be able to extract from all this, from the EU perspective?
Yes, so as I said earlier, I think with the data coming in for the member states, and some which has already come in, these reports will be made publicly available, and they can act as a useful repository to all the different stakeholders wanting to implement actions and maybe seek some inspiration on what has been done successfully. And we can make sure indeed actions are being taken consistently across all the member states, and give credit for good initiatives to promote media literacy across populations of all ages. But not only with this reporting, I think it's important also to acknowledge the different other projects taking place also at European level. We have funding given out for the Creative Europe program to boost innovative cross-border media literacy projects. We have an ongoing call for proposal for European Festival for Journalism and Media Information, media literacy information. And we also fund outside the EU projects in the Western Balkans to to train media literacy skills for students. So with all these projects coming together, I think we may have some keys for development in this field. Not also to underestimate the role of EDMO, which the Commission is also funding, and different projects taking place across Europe. So I'm quite hopeful for the way where we are headed, and I hope we can all read more about these inspiring examples and approaches relevant for all the different players in the coming weeks and months.
Thank you, Sophia, and I think that will be the end. Hopeful is a good ending note, isn't it? So let's give the panel a warm hand. And now I believe we're supposed to summarize this, so you're not getting off the hook just yet.
So as Annette has been saying, in the program you saw a discussion and summary, and you may have been wondering what is this exactly, because there's no persons related. Your eyes are not failing on you. I was here yesterday already, as many of you have been following the 2 days. And the organizers didn't only structure this conference very nicely. I think it's like building blocks that put one onto the other, ending where we probably have to do most still, and that is in trying to educate, as the panel was called, the citizenship, to deal with this. But because it's been so much, the organizers also had the right thought to say at the very end we should do a wrap-up session. And kindly, they didn't choose one person to do so, but we're going to do it together. So all the fellow moderators, please, on stage. We had 4 sessions, plus obviously the opening session, which we're not going to deal with again. You can either, here you've got the computer, sit there. So what we're going to do is we're going to briefly run through the 4 sessions with just a very quick summary, basically one main takeaway from each of the moderators, which is nearly impossible because we had the diversity of opinions, but just so we get a ground basis, and then we will have a conversation here, and possibly also with the one or other of you, because it's also called discussion. So if today is the only opportunity where you can not only ask a question, but also comment, if you want, on one of the findings, even though not all of the speakers are still here. But in order to stay in the building blocks of the organizers of the conference, I will first give the floor very briefly to you, Tobias. It was a diverse panel, I would say. There were many different thoughts issued, but you had the joy of moderating the tech reg, if I may say so. Not the reg tech, but the tech reg, so tech platform regulation panel. What would you say is one of the main things that we should take away when we leave the conference from that panel?
Yeah, so I think one of the things I took away at least was that the conflict between the tech sector on one hand and the regulatories at the other are still there. So some people fear too much regulation and others want to regulate more. But we are also seeing all tech representatives saying that they see the need for this regulation. They're just fearing especially uneven playing field and the difficulties to compete. And then I thought it was really interesting to hear Eleonora present her ideas that we are seeing more regulation being built on principles of rights and more values, and that makes the regulation stronger, but at the same time it's also making it more conflicting. So we're seeing different regulation and different right principles meeting each other, conflicting, and that will make it difficult in the future, making more regulation, because it will be more and more complex access to navigate these different laws.
And that also means that the end of the story of a law is not when it has been passed. That's one of the takeaways I had, but that's actually where it begins, the application. Yeah. As Eleonora also said, at the end before courts, but even on the way there in the implementation in the member states. And that's maybe one of the reasons that in the panel that I could moderate, where we focused more on the question, now that the regulation of platforms and their responsibility has increased over the last years, what about the role of the media and how can that be enhanced? And one of the issues we didn't deal with in detail, simply because we were focusing more on the legislative framework, was supporting editorial media, which is also an element which was mentioned at the one or other moment, saying it's not enough to have the right regulatory space, But there will also have to be some forms of support, which is already ongoing in parts, in initiatives on modernizing journalism or sustainability of editorially working media companies. But when we turn back to the regulatory aspect, I found it interesting to see that there is this probably unfulfillable wish towards the European Media Freedom Act to close all of the gaps and loops which have built up over the years. So what you have described as maybe the controversies or the conflicts that potentially are there, and obviously probably this idea that there's one last final piece in the one puzzle is too much of wishful thinking. But certainly I found it interesting to see that there is a general consensus that the editorially led media have been maybe too much under the radar over the last years. I don't know whether that was also your feeling when you were listening, and that it is about time that legislation does something which is not so much regulating them, but regulating the space in which they act. So it's nearly like what used to be competition law. Competition law has to make sure that there is a space in which the competitors can work and compete under proper conditions. And if it's not the case, then they intervene through, for example, competition authorities. Now we are looking towards creating a regulation that makes sure that the space is there to compete between editorial media companies and tech platforms and others. So that was my main takeaway. And then very nicely, one of the issues that came up with EMFA was, well, and who's going to take care of enforcing it? And that's where you come in.
Yeah, maybe just before answering the question on the main takeaway, may I just pick up on what you said on Mr. Breton's puzzle? Indeed, as you said, I mean, it will not be 100% complete, but still, I think we touched upon several aspects where it brings significant pieces towards completing the puzzle. And two of them, which we mentioned across panels, I think, were the treatment of media content by platforms and on media platforms, on which I think we agree that it's good. We have something here in EMFA to complete a gap in the DSA, and we have to make it better, but it's there, so we have a hook. And the second one is the issue of third countries' media, which obviously pose a severe threat to our societies. And here again, we are very much aware, especially on the regulator side, of the loopholes in the AVMSD, and we here also have a hook to make it significantly better, and we have to make the provision under Article 16 better in EMFA, but still there is something. So these are, I think, two examples of significant steps towards completing the puzzle. Mm-hmm. And now to answer your question, there were many interesting things in the panel, but I maybe focus first on the idea of independence of media regulators, because it was heavily discussed, and I know not only here on this scene today, but also in other surroundings. And okay, I think it was good to go back to the roots of this, which is that media regulation fundamentals are to strike a balance between freedom of speech and core values of protection of audiences, and that therefore, by nature, it calls for the strongest independence requirements and guarantees. And that's true nationally speaking, and we should always remain vigilant in this, insofar as this is actually guaranteed and in fact implemented. And that's true at the European level. And here we had this debate on, okay, what's in EMFA regarding the independence of the newly created European Board for Media Services. And what came out of it is that it should at least enjoy the level of independence that other networks such as BEREC or the European Data Protection Board do enjoy, at least because the underlying objective of content and media regulation, probably insofar as they are directly linked to democratic values and freedom of expression, call for an appropriate distance between the regulators and the executive bodies, including the European Commission. And I finished there for now. As it was underlined, probably this is not completely the case for the moment in the EMFA proposal, as there are title links with the Commission. Just to mention one example which was given, the fact that the staff of the board or the board secretariat will be made available, taken out of Commission staff. So that was one thing, independence.
I think you were by far not going over time, because there was also very much in that panel. One thing that was not discussed, but because we're talking about takeaways and you always need a hook that you can remember something. You mentioned potentially the comparison to other boards should be from the perspective of saying the most independent and self-functioning board should be the one in the media sector. So maybe there is a small indication in the EMFA, not even sure whether the authors had this in mind, but all the other boards have an abbreviation. So the European Data Protection Board, we generally refer to as an EDPB, the European Board for Digital Services will have an abbreviation. And in this piece of legislation, the European Board for Media Services will be the board. Okay, the board. So remember that. Maybe that is an indication of the role that the board will have. Until now, it's called ERGA. It's got an abbreviation. In future, will be the board. On that note, and yours is the freshest one, but nonetheless, that panel is also interesting because it a little bit brings together what we were discussing at the beginning. Why? Because in the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, as we heard, we have this provision. There will have to be reporting on the media and information literacy initiatives. And at the same time, what we heard was a lot of what do platforms do, not even the platforms that are necessarily covered by the AVMSD in terms of active media and information literacy initiatives. So what is your takeaway that you want to give to the others?
Yes, so just summarizing the panel first, maybe that's not useful since we just heard it, but my takeaways, of course, is safeguarding trust, how we need to move from some type of reactive to proactive action, and I think that's also a ball rolling towards the policy side, you know, tying in scientific evidence, understanding that target groups, public campaigns doesn't work anymore, if I'm going to be blunt. We need to be much more granular in our approaches to different target groups when it comes to vulnerabilities, but also abilities, I would like to say. Building structure, but not too much, not parallel tracks. And that brings me to comment a little bit about this, because of course, many of these legislative approaches have the same target groups in the platforms, even though it doesn't matter if it comes from the DSA or for the AVMSD or a copyright directive, which we haven't mentioned, but that's also the same target group. So possibly there is something there that with that legislative machinery that has created these pieces of legislation, it will be extremely interesting to see how this plays out. Difficulty in the measuring, I would say also. The reporting foreseen, we heard about it, it's coming in already. We talked about the wider reporting versus a more standardized way to create more comparability. We will be following the Nordic MIL example, of course, to see how that falls through, or how what the results will be. And I think we've finalized on the need for long-term policy efforts and sizable resources to this area. And the point I would like to do, except for the need for long-term sustained effort and resources, is also that my experience is that we in different levels of national government, regulators, etc., we are very slow. Industry is very fast at the moment. Sometimes I can follow questions I've seen in my career 7 to 10 years later, we're talking about a draft of a regulation. And of course, with this complexity that we discussed, this time lapse might increase. I mean, we heard we should have the same offline and online legislation, and we heard that for many years. And we also discussed the reactive to proactive. So what would happen if we would be more proactive in our legislative efforts? What would happen if we would gaze into the future and not build something late on something that's already a problem, but actually create a legislative landscape for the society built on the core values of the European Union that we want to see? That's my that little
and maybe already builds the bridge to another conference, but potentially the Swedish Presidency or whoever is going to do on the AI Act, whether the AI Act is the first example of a proposal in advance of the problem based on EU values, and how that also interferes or interacts with the transatlantic dialogue. One of the joys of the European Union as such, but also of these presidency conferences, is that you also learn a little bit about the different regional approaches obviously. We have the diversity of member states and the cultures, and I found an interesting point that you made. Obviously, we're here in the Nordic region, and so we would be expecting to hear some examples from Sweden, or we heard also example from Norway a moment ago. But you brought the theory of saying we're somewhere in the middle with the Nordic region, because it's not one individual member state, which might be too small. It's not the EU as the complete, but we have like something in the middle. After these 2 days, do you think that is a sustainable model to say some initiatives stay at member state level, for example, responsibilities of individual regulatory authorities, others are dealt with like harmonizing a regulation at the level of the EU, but there should also be some form of cooperation, for example, across language regions or across, as in this case, cultural regions. Is that something that you want to also remind us of? Because if I remember correctly, you squeeze it in somewhere, and I found it a very interesting point.
Yeah, so I think my journey on that started with a meeting with Meta this summer, where they had set up, we sent out 3 ministers from Denmark to San Francisco to hand in this document where we applied to get data on different topics, disinformation, misinformation, things we trouble with, for 4 or 5 different big tech giants. And that was like a good dialogue, and everything was working fine. And then the last meeting, Meta, we met up with like one representative were on her way to maternity leave, and a few researchers, which we were all confused and speaking about different things. And they showed up with 8 high-level leaders from Meta.
Wow.
And we were just beaten down. I mean, not that they're very friendly, but we didn't have a chance. They were so much more talented than us. And I think that made me think about like what kind of resources do you meet with? Like these organizations are sometimes the size of the small territories in Denmark, and they can pull in people, and they have more like thoughts. So in making this a more level playing field, I think we have to think about how to like put our resources together, and there will be like limits to this, and sometimes the law is not working that way, and sometimes we disagree. But I think to look into like actually pulling resources together. I talked with Christel Schandelmose about these things, who was the prime negotiator of the DSA, and she said that one of the biggest fears right now for her about the DSA was actually if they were able to attract talented people enough in the Commission. So can they actually, even though they were allowed to like hire their wage, they can pay these people to something they would never normally pay people, they're still afraid if they can get the right talents. And I think that's something we discuss a little too little.
That's true, and all at the same time, right? There is a demand now, and they all have to be there. I would like to play that back to both of you also with this regionalization. So, for example, for the media and information literacy, it's obvious that you were working together on similar initiatives. But is it true? Can we take that as one issue? Yes, there is misinformation, which is probably similar, or campaigns that we also heard about from Beth that are similar across the member states of the EU and beyond. But there are probably also issues which only target or are of a different relevance for certain regions. I mean, let's think about the Ukrainian war and how that already has been of relevance, the building up to that for the Baltic states over a decade, and maybe for other EU member states it was not so much on the radar. Does that teach us that we have to be also a bit careful not putting one-size-fits-all solutions, even in the area of media and information literacy?
Absolutely. I mean, when it comes to content, of course, it's very contextualized, and how you decode something can be extremely different, even in different groups in the same region. So, and that goes to why I wanted to talk about diversity earlier on, because ethnicity, all these different things will play. So I think what I would like to say, in just to grab a little bit on also what was said earlier, I think we need to reflect on our relationships with the very large platforms, and if we take that 10 years ahead perspective just for the sake of it, what if they are no longer extremely rich and powerful? What will have happened maybe when they will need to to come to our table as whatever our is, regulator or national government or parliament or whatever. I think that's really important because I think that time can come. It can come sooner than 10 years. What would that situation be? The scenario of the need of a government, the need of defense, the need of the regulator from their perspective, and just try and see the topics from there. I think that would be really helpful when we continue to build the future.
So you opened up a new door, which I'm going to give both to you now. So from your perspective, and it's great that you're not only the moderator, but a well-informed moderator because you're in the same role yourself as well. From the regulator's perspective, both this issue is how much of it is regional, the issues that you're dealing with, and therefore cannot just be hyperventilated to the level of the EU. And at the same time, have you experienced a shift in the way that other actors than the traditional media actors are dealing with you, or approaching you, or discussing with you over, let's say, the last 5 years, meaning the tech platforms?
Yeah, on the first question, I would really agree with what was said, which is that when you look at what is happening in the content of the platforms, what is relevant is really local. So it means countries, or even in bigger countries, sub-countries. I mean, Länder in Germany probably, or something like this. But, as was said as well, you will not relevantly regulate these global players if you stay at your national level. So that's where you need enforcement at the European level. That's what we have in DSA, actually. And now we have to make it come live, actually. That is to say, the Commission, which is very well aware that as the enforcer, main enforcer, vis-à-vis the VLOPs and VLOSes, they are aware they cannot do it by their own, so they have to rely heavily on national regulators to be aware of what is happening in the countries with the various languages, the various culture, or the actuality, or the elections, or whatever, which is where it's relevant. And reciprocally, well, the national regulators have to be enough empowered so that they are able, to push this information, this crucial information, to the European Commission as the enforcer. So that's what we have to build now in the board, not the EMFA one, but the DSA one. And to your second question, yeah, definitely, there's a tremendous change. Actually, in France, we are lucky because we had national laws already a few years ago, first on disinformation and then on hate speech, which enabled us to go and see these guys, the platforms, and start talking to them and asking them and challenging them to some extent. So it already started easily like this, but it's the case in many of the other member states. And now it's also the case because the Audiovisual Media Services Directive gave this power to everybody. And now we have to get to the next level with the DSA, but we already have solid grounds and experience already on the side of regulators of talking to these people. And now what is very welcome is that we have additional tools to challenge them more efficiently and go further on this way.
So the family of regulees, as I learned today, you approach them, has been much bigger. Before I give the floor back to you, there is a couple of minutes also that we can take comments. We have to juggle a little bit with the microphone because we've only got one, we share that. Is there anyone that would like to add a comment, even a question? Maybe we cannot answer the question completely from the audience. Think about it, otherwise you get the next comment.
They're exhausted. They want
Which is
break.
possible.
I just wanted to add that I think it's interesting that we're talking about content legislation, and I know that we have said that the EU is competent for we say illegal, and then illegal. What is illegal? That will be decided by the member states, and then we end up, of course, with a discussion of the content that is not illegal, and I would say even let's not limit ourselves to content because it's also about the manipulation, the interaction design, the UX, and how that actually affects us. And that is not regulated that much. There's some small phrases in the DSA, and that could maybe be interpreted that way, but I don't believe it will be useful since it's not so clearly. And I also think we should have self-regulation of interaction design, since it's extremely pervasive and can really shift thoughts and actions of people. Automation, so this is my question to you guys. So this is done by automation. We will have AI implemented. We are going into an AI era. We haven't talked about that so much today. I guess you talked about that yesterday, but the skills and the fact that government, I mean, we have all the misinformation and what we don't like out there, it's already automated. There's already AI implemented, but government is not there. So that gap is really worrying me. They agree.
We're not, but I actually think, I was just going to say, Tobias will definitely add on that one.
Yeah, so one of the considerations we work with is actually if government is maybe not the most interesting actor then. So, because there are no tradition for AI people working in government, at least not in Denmark. I don't think I've ever met anyone who did AI in the government. But we're seeing a lot of the NGOs in Denmark actually having data scientists, and they will work there because they have some general interest in the case, and maybe they'll get less wage. So we are thinking about like where do we actually place some of these things that are not like completely legislation, but might be in the interplay as a way of attracting.
If I may add to this, from a perspective of regulators, yeah, definitely, this is something we need to improve on. We already are, for some of us, hiring some data scientists and looking into what is happening inside, under the bonnet of the platforms. This is not at all to say that we intend to do it all, because it would be completely impossible, and without our possibility to reach this would ask for immense resources that we won't have and we shouldn't have even. But it's to say that we must have the minimal skills to understand what it's about, and to be able then to mobilize other resources. And these other resources are NGOs, are researchers. The research community can be very powerful there. Of course, the other regulators across the board. So it's really about cooperation and about being able to each bringing its piece to the whole scheme. But to do so, we each have to have at least some competency, and this is what we are now getting to
develop. Actually, I'm glad you said it, so it doesn't look too much as self-advertising. But indeed, I was, as an academic, going to say it is maybe no coincidence that at the topic that we're discussing in this conference, there are nearly in every panel also a representative of academia. There are the research projects like the MPM, the EDMO, because I think that is where we're moving to. There is no individual section that is at the table that can develop quick enough to cover it all, not the regulatory authorities, not the ministries. Maybe most comes from civil society because they are the ones that maybe discover it first. And I'm never again going to say 10 years ago that job description didn't exist, like I said yesterday, because indeed in AI there will be people that said, I started research in 1964 on AI, but it was a different type of AI that we can agree. And so with that, we are not going to solve all the problems and issues in the next half year of the Swedish presidency. But I do think we all agree that the Swedish presidency has made a great effort to put up in this limited time period that there is for such a conference, a very diverse, very rich conference. Thank you to the fellow moderators. Thank you to all the panelists, but thank you especially to the hosts. And I will give them the microphone for the very last floor. Thank you very much on my behalf.